Hello, and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a range of different mediums books, movies, games, you name it. The only rule is that we can only talk about things in terms of the writing. Anything like acting, animation, or art is off limits unless it relates directly to how the story is being told. I am Daniel Radford, author, Man Trapped in Iceberg, and also your host. And today I'm joined once more by John Kernan as we continue our cycle on action stories.
Yeah, it's going to be very nope, forgot the word for action filled, but it's going to be great.
A pun was attempted and failed today.
Uh, yeah, it was very it was going to be good.
Yes, we're going to be very on the ball today, audience. Last week, I didn't manage to write any notes. This week, we'll say was slightly better, maybe. However, he's set to go to bed soon, and I've managed to wake up just in time to record this, so here goes.
Woo!
We're going to have a focus on Avatar The Last Airbender, a franchise that is near and dear to both of us, I believe. I don't know if you watched it when it first aired, but I did. Way
Oh
back
yeah.
when. So I grew up with this series, and it's one that I'm pleased to every time I look back at it, I can go, it's still good.
It never gets any less good. Avatar is one of the greatest of all time.
Yeah, honestly, if anything, it just gets better every time you see it because as an adult, you can find more and more things to appreciate.
Yeah, no, I mean one of the one of the channels I like to follow for that kind of stuff is called Cinema Therapy. They just did an
Yes,
episode. They
on
just
Iroh,
did an
yeah.
episode on Iroh a little while ago, and spoiler alert, the therapist, while actively trying, still couldn't find anything to disagree with Iroh on. The man is
Yeah,
just right.
fantastic channel, that one. So a bit of housekeeping before we really get into it. There is a lot of Avatar content these days, and we
Oh,
might
the
end up
trailers.
dipping into like the canon comics or novels or Legend of Korra, which exists, or at the time, the new at the time of writing this Netflix adaptation. Because if this was going out at the time of recording, it would be very topical. But by the time you hear it, it no longer will be.
We're so topical.
discussing discussing a movie version would be cool too, but sadly that doesn't exist.
Yeah, I don't know if we'll ever get an Avatar movie. It'd be cool if we did.
Yeah, but you know,
But hey, there's those James Cameron avatars.
yep, those exist all right.
They might be the
So
only ones, but they're there.
so something we talked about a little bit in the first episode of the cycle was how action doesn't have to be shallow and meaningless. And there are a lot of different ways that you can add a lot more depth to action. We also talked about how to make action in a written form uh, dynamic and compelling, which is not going to be super relevant today since neither of us, I think, have actually read the books or uh, the Kyoshi novels. But the former aspect of action writing, I feel like, is very relevant to Avatar because it does pretty much all of the things we talked about to make action feel important and engaging at a deeper level, and then some extra stuff on top of that.
Yeah, it's probably the most meaningful action I can think of in a story, in addition to just being some of the best in general.
Yes, because when it boils down to it, action sequences, especially combat, which is what most of the action in Avatar is, when they occur, they are very rarely just action for the sake of action. there is usually some sort of equally important and related ethical or philosophical or just character conflict occurring at the same time, which adds a lot more narrative weight to the action that is occurring on screen.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the things we talked about a little bit last time, and one of the things I think about a lot when it comes to action and stories, is how frequently the most important and also difficult challenge with like writing action is weaving it into the story properly so that they support each other. In Avatar, you would have a much harder time separating the action and the themes and stories and narrative because it's interwoven just about as naturally as it could possibly be with the world's history, its philosophies, its characters and their motivations. It is such a pure and intrinsic part of the whole thing.
Yeah, it definitely is. And your cat seems to agree.
Oh no, is the bell being heard?
Loud and clear.
I I'm trying to keep it quiet. Continuing to wave his wand around is the only way to stop him from destroying the podcast. He is he is a little goblin and he is an orange cat, and as we all know, orange cats are bananas.
Yeah, speaking as a person who has 3 cats in the house, uh, no orange ones, but I can confirm for you that black ones are also insane, and our gray one's neurotic. So I think just cats in general.
Oh, cats in general for sure. It's just been hearing a lot the past couple of years that apparently orange cats in particular are like apparently there is some sort of correlation between the gene for a cat being orange and a gene that makes cats crazy.
I mean, all of us gingers are a bit nuts.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said it because I shouldn't say it, but I
You're not
thought it.
one of us. You don't get to.
But I
Uh,
thought it.
it's all right. There's a animator on YouTube who does like Avatar fight scenes, but replaces all the characters with cats.
I'd watch that.
You know,
Dang,
to bring us back around to being on topic. I did it.
that's got to be some real action.
Huh. Uh, but yeah, so even before we get to like character specific struggles, right? Because of the way that bending works, the magic system in Avatar: The Last Airbender, the way a lot of the characters have the ability to control one of the classical elements and have a like martial art based around that they are practitioners of, specifically Chinese martial arts, like elements of kung fu and the like. Almost every like commonly practiced fighting style in the Avatar world has some, or even the nation, because the nations are so intrinsically linked to the elemental bending system as well. Each one tends to have a very distinct philosophy attached. So when conflict happens, uh, when there are fight scenes between two characters or groups of characters with different elements, they are also typically also philosophical clashes, sometimes even within different styles of the same element.
And like your thoughts and your emotions are also such a powerful part of your ending that it's always also at least some sort of either emotional or philosophical, sometimes both, clash between the characters as their specific interpretation of the style like speaks to who they are.
Yeah. So if we have a look at the 4 elements, we've got, of course, air, it being the Last Airbender, and the air nomads were spoilers for the show if you haven't seen it. All dead except one of them.
Yeah, I've heard he's the last one.
The the air nomads as a people were all about freedom, very focused on just living life, avoiding conflict, being at peace, being spiritually and physically free. And
Avoiding attachment to the earth, whether that or well, no, I'm not avoiding attachment to the earth, but avoiding attachment to worldly needs and desires and all the things that weigh you down to the earth,
yes, culturally they were like very Shaolin monk-esque,
including being bald.
right down to the being bald, yeah.
Can't be a
And
good monk if you've got hair.
you heard it here first. First step, shave head. Second
Yeah.
step, enlightenment. Third, probably not profit. They don't like that.
If you get enlightened, you're allowed to grow your hair back, but you better be able to back that up with receipts first, or they're going to be real mad you've got hair.
So because of this, that means culturally the martial art that they practice, airbending, reflects a lot of those cultural ideals. It is a lot less about striking your opponent, and it is much more about avoiding being hit yourself. It is about being light on your feet, quick, flighty, and evasive, and waiting for your enemy to knock themselves out almost. It's not like they never strike in practicing the martial art, of course, because that would be a very impractical fighting style. But it is all about continuously moving, staying light, and it's very rarely about directly damaging your opponent. It's more about defending yourself and keeping them away from you and others.
Yeah, it's also it's also much like their society very important to stay free and despite waterbending, which we'll get to, also being fluid. But uh, I find it, I just found myself wondering, I wonder if that is part of why they matched Aang up as his first and like closest ally with a waterbender. Air and water both both flow freely and have certain like shared mechanics that the other elements don't.
I mean, gases and liquids are both fluids, so that checks out. And philosophically, I would say air and water are the two that are closest to each other.
Hmm. I
Uh,
love
because
science.
so it does make some sense that that they would start with water. But yeah, so that's air, and naturally because of the cultural side of things, uh, and the way that that translates to the martial art, the main character, the titular Last Airbender, Aang, is a very flighty, non-committal, freedom-loving, pacifist kind of character, and that is reflected in him as part of the culture he came from, and in his combat style, in the way he moves, rarely attacks first, etc., etc., and his general just focus more on dodging and weaving than smacking.
Yeah, he never stops moving, never stops thinking, stays very light on his feet, does whatever he can to avoid being attacked, usually quite well. He sticks to what he knows, and I respect that.
Yeah, I mean, it's both the element that he grew up learning. It is also the one that philosophically matches his temperament the most. So he does tend to default to focusing on air most of the time. which I think is a very cool thing because of something we see in the sequel, Legend of Korra, right? Where despite being born to the Water Tribe, because of her personality being very passionate and aggressive, she tends to default to fire, which is which is a thing avatars can do. They get all of the elements.
Yeah,
That's their whole shtick. But we'll get to fire in a second because there's some interesting stuff with fire as well. But before that, we'll do the logical thing and go to water because water is also very fluid in nature, but it's philosophically the water tribe is less about being free and untethered and evasive and more about adaptability. In the show, when the character we mentioned briefly earlier, Iroh, is being the wise sage of the years and explaining the like philosophical implications of all the elements, he describes it as the element of change because of all of them, it is the one that most easily shifts from one form to another. But personally, I
yeah,
would,
changing its shape, its state of
yeah,
matter.
personally, I think calling it the element of adaptability makes more sense and would have been a little bit more accurate, right? Because when it comes to how the waterbenders move and act in combat, yes, that's a big part of it is that they have very sort of flowing, almost Tai Chi-ish kind of movements. They're all about that flow of energy and redirection of energy. But they're also very much about making do with what you have.
Yeah, it's a very strong, unavoidable part of their culture, even just from how they've lived. For a long time, they were not to the same level, but like partially nomadic, like the like the air nomads were, and like even when even though they always settled down, they've had to change where and how they're settled many times throughout history, and they've grown to be able to live in any kind of environment.
Yeah, to the point where the actual water tribe, as it is called, is actually split into three subsets that live in different parts of the world, one at each pole and one in a swamp in the middle. And the common recurring theme with all of the elements except fire is that you have to get your element from the environment. It has to already be present. And the waterbenders are very adept at finding water, usable water in different places. They are all about. I mean, They primarily the two largest subsets live in the poles, and part of that is surely because there's so much water, both liquid and frozen, around that they are never without an arsenal. But we see also the swamp benders from the tribe in the middle of the Earth Kingdom. Technically, they bend swamp water, yes, but they will also manipulate the water inside plants.
Yeah, and which makes sense. We don't get to see that much of their style visually, but because of the different things they're manipulating in a different way, it itself begins to look a little more like earthbending. Not as solid, but much more much more direct and making the movements they need to make to
Yeah,
control a solid physical object that can still bend, much like kind of a little bit more like earth when earthbenders are controlling loose rocks and mud, as well as like one thing that's very unique to water as an element is it's the element. They're all elements of life, but water more so than the others, because for one thing, life can't exist without it, and it's also the only element that can, to a point, control living things, such as the plants and blood bending.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna get into this because we see other sources of water like very innovatively used at points. We get water pulled out of plants. We get sweat is used in a pinch at one point, and quite famously and terrifyingly when it is introduced, there is a lot of water in the human body, especially in the blood, and
Blood is almost completely water with just a couple additions.
which means a skilled enough waterbender is able to manipulate the blood inside a person. And that is horrifying.
It is horrifying, and that's reflected well in the style, in that the few times we see blood bending, the movements are much more jerky, almost spasmodic, and like violent
Yeah.
looking, completely clashing with any other form of waterbending you see, much like philosophically it clashes with just about everything we're comfortable with as people, because puppeteering another human being is horrifying.
Yes, for sure. That's because that's the cool thing about bending in general is that the personality and just culture and style of the bender are always relevant in how the action scenes are choreographed and how their combat style is represented. And we're going to touch on that some more with the other elements too.
Before we move on, I just remembered a big one we forgot. Because earthbending has its almost equivalent to waterbending, but even scarier. Somebody took a little. I'm breaking kayfabe a little bit here because this actually did not happen in The Last Airbender, but we can just talk about Avatar in general. It's fine.
Said we might
Um,
dip into Korra.
yeah, the same principle for waterbending, if you are good enough, also applies to air. We get to see someone be assassinated by having the air bent out of her lungs and then spun around her head to create a vacuum.
Yeah, it's it's the single most aggressive and offensive use of airbending we ever see in the franchise.
And the scariest part about it is it has its own philosophy too. And despite how horrifying it is, both the look of it and the movements and the feeling behind it are much more gentle than bloodbending, because that form of airbending comes from a philosophy not of lack of attachment, but taken to the logical extreme of nothingness. It's what allows Zahir to fly, and it's what allows him to bend somebody's air away, that he literally has no attachments. Nothing. Only his beliefs and his philosophy to push forward through. There is no emotion, no feeling in what he is doing, which is why he can use these gentle, natural looking, like swirling airbending movements. Not that different from Aang making his goofy, silly little airball he rides around on to suffocate somebody, because there's no malice behind it,
It's just business.
no hatred. He's just, he's doing what he has to
It's just
do.
yeah.
And honestly, he probably doesn't have a single thing against the woman he is murdering.
I mean, he does. He definitely does. But
Personally, I
it's
mean.
yeah, it's not personal. It's about the system she represents rather than anything about her as an individual. He probably doesn't like her very much because she's obnoxious, but
And I appreciate, actually, I honestly appreciate that Korra is the only place we could see this, and not just Korra, but later on, and from somebody who is not a part of the airbending culture, because Aang and anybody raised as an airbender would never even conceive of being able to use bending that way. It is,
they're pacifist by nature.
despite being despite being a logical extreme end of a similar philosophy, it is so completely counter to how they think and how they feel and the basic core tenets of airbending that you almost wouldn't even think somebody could do it until you see it happen.
For sure. Backtrack a little bit to water as well. Not necessarily action, but we may as well touch on the fact that healing, like spiritual healing, is also part of the waterbender skill set, and that also does fit into this philosophy of adaptation and change from one state to another, because it is all about moving spiritual energy through the point of an injury to speed up its recovery, changing it from the state of injured to the state of no longer injured. And all of the movements in typical waterbending, even in the more aggressive stuff like bloodbending, is fairly fairly fluid by comparison to most of the other stuff, right? But it is always about changing something, the way something moves, or the way something flows, and adapting to the situation, to what you have available. Like
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say, aside from one major example, who we're going to get to soon, the waterbenders in the series are consistently some of the most innovative in what they do.
Yeah, including to break into Korra a little bit again later, like technologically and societally.
Well,
If
technologically,
they it doesn't get that far, but like the advancements show that other than, lacking the raw materials and easy manipulation of metal, as a culture, waterbenders would have the same, like I believe the same opportunities to be technological as some of the other as the other nations because they're so adaptable, but they're they're so naturalistic.
I also think it just comes down to, I mean, they're culturally and also physically, like mechanically, not really geared towards industrialization or anything. But innovation doesn't necessarily, like, we tend to think of innovation in the sense of technological progress, but that's not what innovation has to be. It's innovation is not necessarily about bit more technology. It's about it's about clever use of what you have. It is about thinking of new ways to do things. And that's where and that's where the water tribe as a whole collectively shine. They're so versatile compared to every other uh, bending style. They have many subcategories, and it's just so good at using what they have available to them that collectively there is only one character outside of the water tribes who I think really embodies that kind of spirit. And we're going to get to her very shortly, probably, because the next element on the list is Earth.
Ah, yes.
Now,
Earth.
before we spend the rest of this podcast forgetting to do fire and just talking about how cool Toph is,
Love tough.
we may as well go over the general philosophy of Earth, which is be stubborn.
Hmm. Be like rock.
Yeah,
No move. Very hard head.
being the philosophy of earthbending is typically be resilient, be resolute, be physically and emotionally strong, be unmoving like stone. And good God, does it show in their combat? Because with the exception of one person in the base original Last Airbender series, basically every significant Earthbender we see, other than the shady Dai Li, which is a very cool touch, are buff as hell, big burly dudes, and Earthbending like combat movements are typically very grounded and rooted and super direct. They are all just like straight punches.
Yep. It's it's the most it's the most direct, least fluid style, as well as the natural opposite of air.
Yeah, where air is all about be being evasive and untethered, Earth is all about holding and maintaining your ground and being firmly rooted to your spot and being instead of unhittable, it's about being unmovable mostly.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's cool. I mean, it shows if, fittingly, like if you were to have to guess at the like philosophy behind any element, I feel like you would very quickly be able to figure Earths out just by watching how they engage in their martial art.
And how they engage in just about every aspect of everyday life. It shows so strongly in their culture, even just through the architecture, but also in the way they adapt to their environments. Everything in like Earth culture is so direct. All of their buildings are smooth, flat surfaces, sharp edges, straight lines, rectangles, cubes, like the way they deliver things, while inventive with their little sleds and big slides, is also still just a system all set up so that you can directly push the thing quickly from
Yeah,
one place to
it's
another.
like you go, wow, a train. That's so. Uh, oh, their train is actually just being pushed by two guys at the back.
It just it just it's just really good at going in one direction, and I guess that fits with them. It's it's heavy, it moves when it wants to, and it moves in one direction.
I mean, their whole philosophy shows very strongly in their society that whole philosophy. They are typically very traditionalist, very stubborn, and hilariously unbending to the point where they are the last true resistance against the Fire Nation invaders. Really, like there's the
Because
Northern
more
War,
than any
right?
other, they're
But
all about roots,
that's
not
even that's a
moving.
stretch. Yeah, exactly. And they hold true to their very strongly to their traditions, and they hold very strongly to their land. They will not give it up.
No. And oftentimes this can be a great strength. But unfortunately, it also means in a lot of ways that the Earth Kingdom is it's resistant to both good and bad change. It happens very slowly.
Fittingly enough. And arguably, it is also the biggest weakness in the earthbending combats, like typical traditional earthbending martial art, because they are so grounded and rooted in one place and focused on being the immovable object. That, in a lot of ways, makes them vulnerable. Yes, you're going to have a hard time doing it, but it's a lot like a turtle, right? It's really hard to break past that shell, but once you do, it's got nothing. And that's not entirely true of an earthbender. Like, yeah, so long as there is rocks to throw at you, they're going to throw rocks at you. But they don't
Yeah,
do a lot of dodging.
you will rarely ever see an earthbender win a clash against anyone or anything that they can't either overpower or just have raw skill far surpassing.
Yeah, like the first time Tafa is introduced in person, we see what happens when Earth meets air and isn't really prepared for it because she cannot pin Aang down and ends up losing because he is so mobile. And that's tough, who we've already hinted is something special. And this is where things get,
Toph is the greatest earthbender in the world.
and she's happy to tell you about it. She's a very interesting character, right? Because her philosophy and her attitude is, of course, very similar to basic earthbending culture in a lot of ways, but there's differences as well. She she embodies a little bit of the waterbender spirit of ingenuity and adaptability. One of my favorite things they did was that they gave her a different, like, they used a different form of martial art as the base for her movements compared to other earthbenders. I can't remember what the style they actually use for most earthbenders, but she uses they used, like, what is it, mantis style kung fu or something like that for the basis for Toph's movements, which
I can't remember. It's I don't I don't th- I think it might be a different
yeah,
one. It's close, but like yeah, it's
it's it is still,
very still very fitting
yeah,
for an
it,
earthbender because the most important part of Toph's style is keeping her feet planted.
I mean, that's part of every earthbender, but the more important thing
No, but she
is,
has
yeah,
to.
I mean, she has to, but the more important thing I was actually gonna, well, not more important, but the thing I was actually focusing in on here, right, is that compared to the typical earthbender who is just hit really hard with big rock over and over and over again, you know, what's the when you're, I guess it's when you're an earthbender, you are a hammer and everything starts to look like a nail. It is
Yeah,
like
yeah,
tough
exactly.
style. It's still very direct and forceful, but it sacrifices a little bit of that unrelentingness to focus on precision, and because of that, she's become a little bit more adaptable. And and a lot of that is because she had to, because she is blind.
Yep. Very fitting that not to skip ahead a little bit, but it's very fitting that Toph is our first metal bender because she is compared to other earthbenders much like a vein of precious ore
Hmm.
compared to pure stone. She is not 100, she's not entirely solid or put together in one piece, but she has that extra precious touch in her that allows her to change more than other earthbenders as well and bring out something more refined in the end than a rock could ever
Yeah,
be.
and I mean, it shows in many ways because that she does not at all resemble the typical earthbender. The typical earthbender you see, the stereotype within the series, is large, ripped dude. Tough is, you know, is a small, blind young girl.
And she's small even for a young
Yeah, and
girl.
like
She is
she is
tiny.
small for, like, she's 12 at the, I believe, the same age as Aang. She is shorter than him, and just in general has a very small look.
She she is a mouse.
Except it will also fuck you up because she is still an earthbender. So she is
The
still the
greatest.
greatest even. She is still very much hammer in a world of nails in her general personality in a lot of ways. But
But she's an artisan hammer.
yeah, but sometimes she's also she's not as an hammer, or she's a chisel, or, you know, she has a much more diverse skill set because it is, whilst being direct, it is still refined and adaptable because she had to develop a different style because she couldn't be the immovable big bulky rock because she is a blind small child. And that's the thing, she turned, in a very waterbender-esque way almost, she turned arguably her biggest weakness in her blindness into her greatest strength because she learned through earthbending to sense tremors and vibrations in the earth. That's why, as John was saying, it's so incredibly important, even more than others, for her to stay rooted and planted on the ground It's because that is how she quotation marks sees.
Yeah. In a way, like she's not just the ultimate earthbender in that she is the best, but she's also like everything about how she lives is being one with the earth around her because it's the way she even has awareness. Like it it is how she lives.
Yeah, she's very aware of the movements of her enemies, even if she can't necessarily see them. And it's that awareness and sense of the world around her that lets her develop this very, again, direct but precise method of combat, where it's less about many thunderous blows and more about one good, sharp, strong strike where it needs to go.
Yeah. Which again is also fitting for metal.
Yeah, which is that's exactly what I wanted to get to, which is it is that ability to be precise and this awareness of the world around her that lets her be the first to realize metal bending is possible because she realizes she can manipulate the fine, precise little bits of impurities in metal, the bits of regular earth that remain, and that means she can shift metal by moving those things, and she can only really like, and that is a skill she can only develop because she can sense those impurities.
And it only comes in a time of great distress
Yeah,
because much like metal, to become a metal bender, Toph had to be forged in fire, both in her everyday struggles and in the exact moment when she finally figured it out.
it was once again making do with what she had. She was stuck in a metal box, and it was continue being kidnapped or invent metal bending. And being tough, she would not she the very earthbender nature. She would not allow herself to go down without a fight. Instead,
There's nothing Toph wants to be less than a
yeah,
princess. She is not going to be kidnapped like one.
instead she says, "This is my box now. Actually,
You made this? I made this.
I will unmake this." And it's not just metal. Like we see, like there are other varieties of earthbending, right? There is sandbenders in the desert who have an almost airbenderish quality to them, which is kind of neat. It's still earthbending in nature. It's just manipulating fine particles. And again, she picks that up very easily because she has that more precise style to her, but also because she is aware and because she is more adaptable than most earthbenders. We see later on that she's capable of bending mud because there is earth in the water. And she never gets to lava bend, unfortunately. That's something that comes out in a as a thing in Korra. But I bet she could if she fucking wanted to.
She could probably figure out, but to his credit, gotta say, she will probably not be nearly as good at it as Bolin because it's probably the one earthbending form I can think of that really just doesn't suit her for various reasons on like a philosophical and emotional level. Other than the fact that it's hot, she's very hot-headed. Like you want to talk about getting fired up, she can do that, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's because it embraces the fact that the unmoving earth is a lie. She is very stubborn. And I think that the difference is that with lava bending is that even though it still has very typical earthbenderish movements to it for the most part, is that it's embracing the fact that Earth is just as much, just like no, maybe not just as much, but it has just as much potential to be fluid if you really want it to be. All you got to do is melt it.
And although you might not expect it, that can be achieved just fine without firebending, because if you can control something, you can move it. And heat comes from vibration.
Yeah, well, I mean, if quick physics lessons, all temperature is a measurement of how fast the atoms in an object are vibrating. And the more they vibrate, the looser the bonds between them get, and they move away from each other. And that's what melting is.
Yeah. On a practical and purely like skill level, Toph could totally, definitely magma bend. I just don't think she could ever master it the same way. I don't think anybody else ever truly mastered metal bending besides maybe Lin, her literal daughter.
And Suyin, who's better than Lin. But
Suyin, who
is
I
also
think
her
we have
literal
covered
daughter.
better before, is better than Lin and her literal daughter, but she's not around right
Yeah.
now. She's busy being great and actually living her life like the only person in her entire family to do so.
But yeah, so it's kind of funny. The thing that makes Tough in the best Earthbender is that she embodies the cultural unbendingness of her art, but is willing to innovate and adapt with it and be flexible with it, where others are not. They are rigid and macro scale, where she is precise and willing to change and adapt, which I think is at least what she's doing combat wise, which I think is neat. The fact that she's kind of this weird outlier that exists philosophically between earth and water almost.
Yeah.
And that's what makes her so good. And this is another thing that Iroh expresses when he's talking about the philosophy behind the bending styles, is that that by learning about the other bending styles and the cultures that they originate from, you can become better at your own. Even if you're not the avatar who does all of it, you can become significantly better at your own style by adapting and learning from other styles. And that's
Yeah.
something you see in actual combat right, especially in combat sports. Even it's Bruce Lee was famous for saying something about, I don't believe that there's all these different styles of fighting. There is only really one style of fighting, or something like that. And that's a philosophy that eventually became mixed martial arts. There are people in MMA, of course, who specialize more in certain things than others, but
Yeah.
there's no one in MMA who is just a striker or just a grappler. They'll typically have like one thing they specialize in, but they will adapt other things from other martial arts because it is mixed martial art.
And
That is
ultimately,
why.
no matter how good you are at doing one thing, doing only one thing is a weakness. You cannot get so perfect at doing only literally one thing that it can compensate for the inherent weakness of doing only one
Exactly.
thing.
And that is why MMA is just kind of cool conceptually as a martial art, and it is also why Toph is such a cool character in a lot of ways, because she embodies that concept, that philosophy. She is the best at what she does because she is willing to adapt. She is unflinching and stubborn and unbending. She is still, in personality, the immovable object in a lot of ways, but she recognizes the importance of being able to use what you have and make do with what you have and innovate and change and manipulate things at a different level. It's great. And Earth is not the only element with some differing philosophies within it. That is very present in fire too.
Oh, I forgot to pipe in a minute ago, but yeah, I think
Oh,
part of uh, part of why the bit Iroh explained about learning from the other bending styles is great too, is because bending is all about existing within and to a point manipulating and controlling nature. And nature and like the world only grow and improve and prosper through all these different aspects of it intermingling together, feeding off of one each other, improving one another and like creating things. And that's why it's also one of the biggest secrets to becoming a a better bender, because it doesn't just fit with the philosophy of any one style. It fits with the core inherent philosophy that all bending is built upon, which is why the most rigid, unchanging, unlearning people we see, even if they start out talented in some way, always, always lose, because they're never going to be as good as somebody who can actually live with the core tenets. You can't escape the fundamentals. And I love it because it's it's not it's not an entirely intuitive fundamental, which is part of what makes Iroh a great philosopher and a great bender, and that he's aware of this thing that would almost be like lost knowledge, kind of fits how far we actually are in the timeline of that world by the time the last airbender is happening, because bending has become so normalized, it's almost taken for granted. Most cultures, most societies in that world, and most benders themselves are thinking about their element as their element. They're not thinking about themselves as a piece. They're not thinking about their element as a piece of the whole. They're thinking about the element as the whole and they're themselves as a piece of it.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's a big part of why when we eventually get to Korra, we see a world where various subforms of the different bending styles have become a lot more prevalent and common, because there's no longer all these, at least especially in like Republic City, there's not all these shattered barriers created and manufactured by war, preventing people from learning these lessons anymore. But as it's we can talk about the world building element as another time. Probably we're running out of time. So which is
Firebending.
yeah, which is why we probably won't get in too much into the fact how the Fire Nation is by far the most industrialized, just purely because they have a constant source of energy. We'll probably touch that in places,
Not
but it's
just
a
a
cool
different
little
source
tidbit that I
of
wanted to mention.
not just a different source of energy. Fire is the one element that cannot be still. Fire is
Yeah,
always moving.
that's gonna be very relevant in a minute. But the first thing we will address is, of course, that we are presented at first early on the series. We learn to view it as very much the element of passion, especially anger. It is the most directly aggressive, confrontational, violent style of combat. It's don't get me wrong, all of the elements have the potential to do horrifying things to people. But as far as just the way they fight, the firebenders are by far the most actively aggressive. The earthbenders are strong, they hit hard, they are immovable objects, but they are still patient in a way, right? They are still rooted in the ground, almost defensive in nature. Not not in the same way as like airbending or whatever, but you kind of get what I mean, right? They are not rush in and start beating the shit out of you. Yeah, they are
They are
solid.
solid.
Firebenders are typically aggressive in their combat. They come in all guns blazing. They're not unrefined or unskilled, but definitely very much wilder, energetic movements than most of the other bending styles. Airbending is also very mobile, but even it doesn't feel energetic and powerful in the same way that the firebenders do, because they do have fairly direct movements, although not quite the same way as much as earthbenders, because they also have more motion. So you end up with this very forceful,
Yeah,
energetic style of combat. It's
because of course, fire is the most direct expression of energy that
exactly,
exists in nature.
and that's what gets interesting because most firebenders are focusing on this aggressive, passionate side of fire. That is where a lot of their philosophy comes from. It's where our primary characters of like Fire Nation characters, for the most part, their style comes from. Zuko, the major firebending character in the franchise, at first, that's very much where his use of fire comes from. Even his sister Azula, the prodigy, who has a very cold, calculated demeanor for the most part. That is still that's still where her bending comes from for the most part. But there is that is not the original philosophy. That is something that has developed in the past 100 years as a result of the uh, Fire Nation's ongoing war with the other nations. Originally, as we learned from a group called the Sun Warriors, who are like this old, hidden away sub society, firebending is and before that it is hinted at by Iroh, which is very neat when he's doing his explanation. Fire is in fact not passion, it is energy, it is life, by the same token, because as John said, fire is the most direct source of energy, of heat, uh, of life in a way, found so it's the most direct source of all that found in nature. Of course, coming from the sun being the primary example of light, warmth, energy. Hence, they're the sun warriors, and we see a shift in the style of firebending used by Zuko because he can't do the other kind of firebending anymore once he mellows out and has his self-realization and character growth. He can't really get his firebending from the same place anymore and has to like find a new source. And his fighting style changes to reflect the changes in his philosophy as he adapts this old lost kind of firebending where it's all about energy instead of aggression, which is very cool. And it's also why that is the style of firebending Aang learns from Zuko. His earlier attempts at firebending were not great. In fact, they scared the shit out of him, and he vowed never to do it again. Obviously, he broke that vow because character growth happened.
Yeah. We don't get to see it very much other than that and like the moments where Aang goes into the avatar state, which are always caused by some sort of
Yeah,
other more specific external source to begin with. But the Aang, in fact, actually has a lot of rage inside him about what's happened to the world, what's happened to his culture and the people he cared about, and all the things that he can't help but feel responsible for
but it's
because the
mostly
Avatar is
inward.
constantly treated like the world is their responsibility. And he's angry at himself. And unfortunately, although anger is not a necessary component of firebending, as we covered already, it lends very well to it, which itself can be a problem if you have that anger inside of you, especially if you don't know how to let it out and control it, which, funny enough, despite part of usually being so aggressive, firebenders are for the most part, when they're not committing war crimes, are actually tend to be very good at letting out their anger and expressing it in healthy ways because you kind of have to be a firebender. If you can't get that aggression out, if you can't let it flow from you, then all it is destruction
Yeah,
with no control. And unfortunately, we see Aang's very first successful attempt at firebending fall directly
Yeah,
into that almost immediately, because although we never get to see him let it out, hell, probably because we never get to see him let it out, that anger is there, just
yeah.
sitting there
I
waiting
mean,
for a spark.
when he's first learning it, his teacher is very cautious with him, very takes it very slowly, and that frustrates Aang because he has that sense of urgency because of his feelings about the whole situation and his like inner guilt and things like that. So he rushes the process, and that causes quite literally a detonation that hurts people around him. That's why he becomes scared to do it again, and that's why it's very fitting that when Zuko relearns this old firebending form where that focuses on energy and life, that's the style that Aang is able to then learn and master from him. Like he still incorporates like Zuko still incorporates elements of the older style as well. He still can tap into that rage and that passion sometimes and still teaches some of that to Aang. We see him practicing the raw, but it
Yeah,
mostly comes from
because that's still a part of you.
and
He has
and that's
that.
that's the interesting thing, right? Is that as we see very early on that firebenders are at their best when they're not explosive, when they are focused and controlled, because that's when you get the major subcategory of firebending, which is lightning. The only other pure, direct form of energy found in nature, lightning.
Yeah, and it fits that much like how precise and like incredibly powerful but also rare lightning is compared to other forms of like nature. Very, very few people can do it. In fact, there's only two people we see who can reliably use lightning in the series. Even Iroh
He
does not
can.
actually
He
lightning.
just doesn't.
He's capable of it, but it doesn't actually fit with him and who he is, which is why he doesn't create it, he redirects it, which is even harder to do, actually.
Yeah, so lightning is the only is the only like you can break it into the generation and redirection as two like different versions of the sub. This one, lightning comes from focus control as and the expression of that energy in a very focused, controlled, and deadly way, because by default, the lightning use at that point in the series, we see it as it becomes a lot more common in Korra, partly because of Zuko's influence, but it's what you do when you want someone dead.
It doesn't serve that much purpose outside of that because even more than fire, it is raw energy. It is literally electricity. So
Yeah,
like
you need like you need that calm and focus and the ability to express that energy in that very precise, focused way, or it's going to get the better of you.
not just precise and focused. We could even say targeted, which fits really well, again, going back to the natural elements, because electricity can electricity cannot just exist like every other aspect of like the elements in nature. Electricity can only go from one place to another. It is always point A to point B, which also means you cannot create and move it without a target. It has to go somewhere. And if you're going to use it, it has to be targeted, which is
Yeah,
also one of the reasons you're rarely ever going to see it used not to kill.
I mean, you actually it becomes when it in Korra, right? It's become a lot more common,
Yeah,
and its primary use in Korra isn't combat. It's generating power for a more industrialized, urbanized world
yeah.
because
How world your benders.
it's because firebending in general has started to adapt more of a Zuko-esque philosophy or a Sun Warrior-esque philosophy. Not completely. There's still a lot of that more angry style. That's in fact the more angry style is very much Korra's thing. Uh, but it's a growth of the philosophy present in the firebending martial art. This idea of it is energy and creation, not destruction and rage. And it shows in how its place in society is shifted. It is no longer the special instant kill weapon of the royal family. It is used by average people in the workplace to generate power that gives the city light and life.
Yeah, I think it actually fits really well with that bit because even Zuko, we never actually see able to use lightning the way Azula does, and unlike in Iroh's case, I don't think it is a choice. I don't He might learn it later for all we know. I think maybe though it's more likely that that form of light of it we see in Korra is what Zuko eventually learned because it's the version of lightning that fits with that sun philosophy. It's You could almost say it's unrefined in a way. I don't think it actually is, but like I think the only reason we see people, mostly regular people using it like that is because it is much simpler and probably easier to use. And
Oh, I don't.
that that prob
It's I don't know if it's simple or easy to use, but it's coming from a better, healthier place, right?
no.
Clarity is essential to the lightning generation. We learn the reason Zuko can't do it in uh, the Last Airbender is because whilst he has focus, he lacks that clarity.
Yeah, I guess I just mean I almost feel like what we see there is actually not lightning bending per se so much as it's such a lazy way to put it, but I want to call it electricity bending.
I kind
What
of
these
get what you
benders
mean, though.
are
Yeah,
doing is letting it flow from them and acting as an extra conduit to bring it into being. They are using a stream of electricity, which is a much gentler thing, as opposed to
a
part of why
strike of
lightning bending
lightning.
was called
Yeah,
lightning bending is you are just making a lightning bolt.
and lightning is a strike for a reason. So yeah, I get what you mean. And it's something that's probably born from that philosophy for sure. Of like, I think it is entirely plausible that Zuko figured out how to do that from a more peaceful place later in life when he had from that philosophy of energy and creation as opposed to destruction. I don't. It's never confirmed anyway, but it's a cool theory and it does make sense.
I really
Of
hope
course,
Republic
there
City
is.
doesn't have the electric chair.
Hmm, God.
Sorry, I just had that thought where I was thinking about electricity used for gentle purposes, and I went, "Oh God, wait,
Or
no,
execution, you
not that
said.
kind of gentle, please."
But of course, yeah, lightning can also be channeled and redirected because it is electricity. It's a current. It flows. And that's where that philosophy of learning, of balance, of drawing from other places other than your own core element comes in, because that is something that Iroh invented after watching waterbenders in action. How they are all about the flow of energy. He went, wait a minute, lightning's energy.
Yeah, he was like, "Wait,
And
fire's just firebending is just is just controlling energy.
I mean, we learn,
Lightning is
to be fair,
energy too."
it's not surprising he came to that conclusion because we learn that he at some point in his life switched to primarily taking his philosophy in firebending from the Sun Warriors. So of course he has the view of flame is life and energy, not aggression, rage, and destruction. And it's that which allows him to take the logical leap from, well, if the waterbenders are all about flow of energy, surely we can do it too because fire is just energy. That's what our, I mean, obviously not actual fire is not, but like the philosophy of firebending, the real philosophy of firebending is creation, life, light, energy. So
You know?
so naturally, lightning, which is a current of electrical energy, could be channeled and redirected. And that again, it's like you said earlier, the way lightning works is you've got to give it a target. So, ra- what Iroh figured out he could do was if he got smacked by lightning, he could then point it at a new target and become a conduit to let it flow to another place.
And I never thought about it before. I think everything you just said is also the reason Pyro is the only firebender I can think of that we also ever see breathe fire.
No, we see others do it. Zuko, that's the roar. Zuko does it, and Aang does it.
No, they do the roar, but they're not, but that's just it. They're roaring. He breathes fire.
That's fair.
Like, and
I
I
mean,
mean, of
he
course,
did he did learn the Sun Warrior style
that's what I
from
was gonna say.
dragons.
Yeah,
So yeah,
later they do it too, but you could also say that's just them doing an extension of what he already learned because it comes from the same place. And yeah, that's what I was just thinking. It actually all fits even better now. I never really made that little three-piece
link. Yeah,
triangular connection of Pyro philosophy, Sun Warrior philosophy, coming from dragons, Dragon of the West, only man to breathe fire.
yeah. Now, audience, you're probably listening to this and going, "This isn't the magic system cycle. You did that last season." So far, really, all you've done is talk about the philosophy of the magic system, and to you, I say, exactly. That's that is one of the things that, like we said, the very beginning of the episode that makes the action in this, not just the Last Airbender, but the like franchise as a whole, so cool, is that the action is tied so deeply to the philosophy of the practitioners of of that martial art. You know, it's even present in the non-benders.
Yeah. Besides, name me one single series with a magic system where the magic system's not core to the action. Now we're doing action. So sit down.
But yeah, I mean, you see it right in the philosophies and stuff like that in the action and the fighting styles used by non-benders as well, prominently, especially later in the series. You know, Sokka's whole thing is that he is not the greatest warrior, but but good God, is he creative and clever and good at using playing to his strengths and using what is around him. He's the group tactician, especially toward the end.
Yeah, I mean,
And
Sokka makes a good Sun Tzu, really.
yeah, because he's creative and uses what is available to him. Something that his sister, Katara, the waterbender of the group, does too, because that is something that is so philosophically part of their culture and the way they learn to fight. It takes him longer to realize that this is that is his strength too, and that he can apply that to being the group strategist. But he even early on starts falling into that role quite naturally. You see a little less culturally defined, I suppose, but you see fighting styles like that of the Kyoshi warriors is very interesting because they're technically Earth Kingdom, but they were founded by an avatar. So they have a very non-typical fighting style for the Earth Kingdom, which is all about redirecting of the opponent's energy and using their own weight, but it's still very Earthbender in a way, right? Because it's still about force and weight. It's just using the opponents against them.
Yeah, it fits very well at the end of the day with what they actually are. And I do love seeing that bit where the philosophies and how they fit into the combat and the action really it goes beyond
Yeah.
even the bending. And it
Yeah.
goes back to the stuff Iroh said too, because where Sokka finally truly finds and understands that part of himself is in his nation's direct opposite.
Yeah. He learns from a guy in the Fire Nation. And that's the thing as well, like it's not just a culture, it is a cultural expression all the time, especially with the bending. But the cool thing about a lot of the non-benders is because they're less tied to their cultural martial art, is that their fighting style gets to be a lot more of a reflection of them as people like May and Ty Lee are fantastic examples. They're two of the most dangerous people in the series. Neither of them is a bender. One of them is very cold and, you know, emo
God dang
and
it.
precise and focused, and is all about not really. She's apathetic and doesn't want to expend more energy than she has to. Her thing is she's a very precise thrower of knives.
Very good.
As apathetic and uninterested in expending unnecessary energy as she is, May has adopted a fighting style that is very sharp and precise, and involves very little active, direct, well, not active, up close engagement. As it's a very energy conservative style. It's I chuck knife at you exactly where I want it to go, and you stop being a problem. Uh, and conversely, Ty Lee is almost kind of airbender like in the way she is, despite her alignment for the most part with the bad guys. She's not directly confrontational. She's big on movement and energy and acrobatics. And her combat style, whilst being sharp and direct in a way, is a lot more about quickly disabling the enemy and making them no longer a problem, making the fight stop. Uh, to the point where she is a chi blocker, meaning she has learned to block pressure points for the flow of energy in the body, thus preventing bending for a while. Which is
Yeah,
also just a very cool addition to the story.
I definitely think that if it hadn't happened 100 years in the future and Ty Lee had been around when like the convergence that brought airbenders back to the world had happened, she would have become one for sure.
I would say so. It just makes a lot of sense to me.
She would also
I
make a
hope that
great
sip of drink I just
waterbender.
had. I hope that sip of drink I just had didn't come over in the recording, but my
It did,
throat
but
was
it's
turning to
okay.
sandpaper.
It's
Sorry,
okay. I rang a
audience.
bell in everybody's ears earlier. It's fine.
Yeah, I could. She would have made a good waterbender as well, because of course she is also in a way all about the flow of energy. It's just she's about making it stop. But yeah, that's all of that is uh, to go back to what I was saying before we went down that little bit of a tangent, is why this action episode has been a philosophy episode, because the it's like John said right at the beginning, the action in Avatar is interwoven so strongly with the world building and the cultural and personal philosophies of its characters that you cannot separate the two. And that's one of the things that makes it so good, is that the action is never just action. It is also a clash of cultures, a clash of philosophies, a clash of character beliefs, a clash of wills. And that adds so much more emotional and thematic weight to the action. And that makes it more engaging and interesting than action for the sake of spectacle.
Yeah,
Action is always
it's
at its best when it's not just action, it's paired with narrative weight.
the more synergy there is between the different elements, the better your results.
A And honestly, look, we could probably do an entire podcast just on Avatar if we wanted, but we both have things we have to do kind of now-ish. So we're gonna have to leave this one there. I would not be surprised if we revisited Avatar at a later date, though. So for now, we will see you guys later. You can, of course, if you are listening to this episode on Spotify or elsewhere, I also post these episodes on my site, radfordwrites.com, where you can also find excerpts from my stories, links to buy my books, and sort of blog article post about various things, including action scenes. Is an article I did a while back. Uh, I also have been gradually working through getting all the episodes of the podcast released on YouTube as podcasts. as a podcast playlist now because Google Podcast has been sort of shunted away, merged into YouTube, however you want to look at it. So that's how we're doing that now. And of course, not only will you definitely see more of John in future episodes and other future projects, you can also see him streaming on Twitch at Sephir, Sephear, sometimes. It's been a little bit busy for it lately, but by the time you
When
hear
life
this, he should be
allows.
back in this. Yeah, by the time you hear this, he should be back in the swing of things. And I believe you also update the post the VODs to YouTube.
Yes, I try to.
All right. Well, until next time, that'll be all for now.
Have fun, everybody, and make sure to always keep your philosophy in your fists. Also, probably maybe don't get in fights, but you know.
The modern day Iroh, everybody. And that's where we are.